Book 1, Chapter 15, of Resurrection. For Nekhludoff, this early Mass remained forever after one of the brightest and most vivid memories of his life. When he rode out of the darkness, broken only here and there by patches of white snow, into the churchyard, illuminated by a row of lamps around the church, the service had already begun. The peasants, recognizing Mary Ivanovna's nephew, led his horse, which was pricking up its ears at the sight of the lights, to a dry place where he could get off, put it up for him, and showed him into the church, which was full of people. On the right stood the peasants, the old men in homespun coats and clean white linen bands wrapped around their legs. Long strips of linen are worn by the peasants instead of stockings. The young men in new cloth coats, bright-coloured belts around their waists and top boots. On the left stood the women, with red silk kerchiefs on their heads, black velveteen sleeveless jackets, bright red shirt sleeves, gay-coloured green, blue and red skirts, and thick leather boots. The old women, dressed more quietly, stood behind them, with white kerchiefs, homespun coats, old-fashioned skirts of dark homespun material, and shoes on their feet. Gaily dressed children, their hair well oiled, went in and out among them. The men, making the sign of the cross, bowed down and raised their heads again, shaking back their hair. The women, especially the old ones, fixed their eyes on an icon surrounded with candles, and made the sign of the cross, firmly pressing their folded fingers to the kerchief on their foreheads, to their shoulders and their stomachs, and, whispering something, stooped or knelt down. The children, imitating the grown-up people, prayed earnestly when they knew that they were being observed. The gilt case containing the icon glittered, illuminated on all sides by tall candles ornamented with golden spirals. The candelabra was filled with tapers, and from the choir sounded most merry tunes, sung by amateur choristers, with bellowing bass and shrill boys' voices among them. Nekhludoff passed up to the front. In the middle of the church stood the aristocracy of the place, a landed proprietor with his wife and son, the latter dressed in a sailor's suit, the police officer, the telegraph clerk, a tradesman in top boots, and the village elder with a medal on his breast. And to the right of the ambo, just behind the landed proprietor's wife, stood Matrona Pavlovna, in a lilac dress and fringed shawl, and Katusha, in a white dress with a tucked bodice, blue sash, and red bow in her black hair. Everything seemed festive, solemn, bright, and beautiful. The priest in his silver cloth vestments with gold crosses, the deacon, the clerk and chanter in their silver and gold surplices, the amateur choristers in their best clothes with their well-oiled hair, the merry tunes of the holiday hymns that sounded like dance music, and the continual blessing of the people by the priests, who held candles decorated with flowers and repeated the cry of "Christ is risen! Christ is risen!" All was beautiful. But above all, Katusha, in her white dress, blue sash, and the red bow on her black head, her eyes beaming with rapture. Nekhludoff knew that she felt his presence without looking at him. He noticed this as he passed her, walking up to the altar. He had nothing to tell her, but he invented something to say, and whispered as he passed her, "Aunt told me that she would break her fast after the late Mass." The young blood rushed up to Katusha's sweet face, as it always did when she looked at him. The black eyes, laughing and full of joy, gazed naively up and remained fixed on Nekhludoff. "I know," she said, with a smile. At this moment the clerk was going out with a copper coffee-pot of holy water in his hand. Coffee-pots are often used for holy water in Russia, and, not noticing Katusha, brushed her with his surplice. Evidently he brushed against Katusha through wishing to pass Nekhludoff at a respectful distance, and Nekhludoff was surprised that he, the clerk, did not understand that everything here, yes, and in all the world, only existed for Katusha, and that everything else might remain unheeded, only not she, because she was the centre of all. For her the gold glittered round the icons. For her all these candles in candelabra and candlesticks were alight. For her were sung these joyful hymns, "Behold the Passover of the Lord, rejoice, O ye people." All that was good in the world was for her. And it seemed to him that Katusha was aware that it was all for her, when he looked at her well-shaped figure, the tucked white dress, the rapt, joyous expression of her face, by which he knew that just exactly the same that was singing in his soul was also singing in hers. In the interval between the early and the late Mass, Nekhludoff left the church. The people stood aside to let him pass, and bowed. Some knew him, others asked who he was. He stopped on the steps. The beggars standing there came clamouring round him, and he gave them all the change he had in his purse, and went down. It was dawning, but the sun had not yet risen. The people grouped around the graves in the churchyard. Katusha had remained inside. Nekhludoff stood waiting for her. The people continued coming out, clattering with their nailed boots on the stone steps, and dispersing over the churchyard. A very old man with shaking head, his aunt's cook, stopped Nekhludoff in order to give him the Easter kiss. His old wife took an egg, dyed yellow, out of her handkerchief and gave it to Nekhludoff, and a smiling young peasant in a new coat and green belt also came up. "Christ is risen," he said, with laughing eyes, and coming close to Nekhludoff, he enveloped him in his peculiar but pleasant peasant smell, and, tickling him with his curly beard, kissed him 3 times, straight on the mouth with his firm, fresh lips. While the peasant was kissing Nekhludoff and giving him a dark brown egg, the lilac dress of Matrona Pavlovna and the dear black head with the red bow appeared. Katusha caught sight of him over the heads of those in front of her, and he saw how her face brightened up. She had come out with Matrona Pavlovna onto the porch, and stopped there, distributing alms to the beggars. A beggar with a red scab in place of a nose came up to Katusha. She gave him something, drew nearer him, and, evincing no sign of disgust, but her eyes still shining with joy, kissed him 3 times. And while she was doing this, her eyes met Nekhludoff's with a look as if she were asking, "Is this that I'm doing right?" "Yes, dear, yes, it is right. Everything is right. Everything is beautiful. I love." They came down the steps of the porch, and he came up to them. He did not mean to give them the Easter kiss, but only to be nearer to her. Matrona Pavlovna bowed her head and said with a smile, "Christ is risen," and her tone implied, "Today we are all equal." She wiped her mouth with a handkerchief rolled into a ball, and stretched her lips towards him. "He is indeed," answered Nekhludoff, kissing her. Then he looked at Katusha. She blushed and drew nearer. "Christ is risen, Dmitri Ivanovitch." "He is risen indeed," answered Nekhludoff, and they kissed twice, then paused as if considering whether a 3rd kiss was necessary, and having decided that it was, kissed a 3rd time and smiled. "You're going to the priest's?" asked Nekhludoff. "No, we shall sit out here a bit, Dmitri Ivanovitch," said Katusha with effort, as if she had accomplished some joyous task, and, her whole chest heaving with a deep sigh, she looked straight in his face with a look of devotion, virgin purity and love in her very slightly squinting eyes. In the love between a man and a woman, there always comes a moment when this love has reached its zenith, a moment when it is unconscious, unreasoning, and with nothing sensual about it. Such a moment had come for Nekhludoff on that Easter Eve. When he brought Katusha back to his mind now, this moment veiled all else. The smooth, glossy black head, the white, tucked dress closely fitting her graceful maidenly form, her as yet undeveloped bosom, the blushing cheeks, the tender shining black eyes with their slight squint heightened by the sleepless night, and her whole being stamped with those two marked features, purity and chaste love. Love not only for him, he knew that, but for everybody and everything, not for the good alone, but for all that is in the world, even for that beggar whom she'd kissed. He knew she had that love in her, because on that night and morning he was conscious of it in himself, and conscious that in this love he became one with her. Ah, if it had all stopped there, at the point it had reached that night! Yes, all that horrible business had not yet happened on that Easter Eve, he thought, as he sat by the window of the jurymen's room. End of Book 1, Chapter 15. Book 1, Chapter 16, of Resurrection. When he returned from church, Nekhludoff broke the fast with his aunts, and took a glass of spirits and some wine, having got into that habit while with his regiment, and when he reached his room, fell asleep at once, dressed as he was. He was awakened by a knock at the door. He knew it was her knock, and got up, rubbing his eyes and stretching himself. "Katusha, is it you? Come in," said he. "Dinner is ready," she said. She still had on the same white dress, but not the bow in her hair. She looked at him with a smile, as if she'd communicated some very good news to him. "I'm coming," he answered as he rose, taking his comb to arrange his hair. She stood still for a minute, and he, noticing, threw down his comb and made a step towards her. But at that very moment she turned suddenly, and went with quick, light steps along the strip of carpet in the middle of the passage. "Dear me, what a fool I am," thought Nekhludoff. "Why did I not stop her?" What he wanted her for he did not know himself, but he felt that when she came into his room something should have been done, something that is generally done on such occasions, and that he had left it undone. "Katusha, wait," he said. "What do you want?" she said, stopping. "Nothing, only—" And with an effort, remembering how men in his position generally behave, he put his arm round her waist. She stood still and looked into his eyes. "Don't, Dmitri Ivanovitch, you must not," she said, blushing to tears, and pushing away his arm with her strong, hard hand. Nekhludoff let her go, and for a moment he felt not only confused and ashamed, but disgusted with himself. He should now have believed himself, and then he would have known that this confusion and shame were caused by the best feelings of his soul demanding to be set free. But he thought it was only his stupidity, and that he ought to behave as everyone else did. He caught her up and kissed her on the neck. This kiss was very different from that first thoughtless kiss behind the lilac bush, and very different to the kiss this morning in the churchyard. This was a dreadful kiss, and she felt it. "Oh, what are you doing?" she cried, in a tone as if he had irreparably broken something of priceless value, and ran quickly away. He came into the dining-room. His aunts, elegantly dressed, their family doctor and a neighbour were already there. Everything seemed so very ordinary, but in Nekhludoff a storm was raging. He understood nothing of what was being said, and gave wrong answers, thinking only of Katusha. The sound of her steps in the passage brought back the thrill of that last kiss, and he could think of nothing else. When she came into the room, he, without looking round, felt her presence with his whole being, and had to force himself not to look at her. After dinner, he at once went into his bedroom, and for a long time walked up and down in great excitement, listening to every sound in the house, and expecting to hear her footsteps. The animal man inside him had now not only lifted its head, but had succeeded in trampling underfoot the spiritual man of the days of his first visit, and even of that very morning. That dreadful animal man alone now ruled over him. Though he was watching for her all day, he could not manage to meet her alone. She was probably trying to evade him. In the evening, however, she was obliged to go into the room next to his. The doctor had been asked to stay the night, and she had to make his bed. When he heard her go in, Nekhludoff followed her, treading softly and holding his breath as if he were going to commit a crime. She was putting a clean pillowcase on the pillow, holding it by two of its corners with her arms inside the pillowcase. She turned round and smiled, not a happy, joyful smile as before, but in a frightened, piteous way. The smile seemed to tell him that what he was doing was wrong. He stopped for a moment. There was still the possibility of a struggle. The voice of his real love for her, though feebly, was still speaking of her, her feelings, her life. Another voice was saying, "Take care I don't let the opportunity of your own happiness, your own enjoyment, slip by." And this second voice completely stifled the first. He went up to her with determination, and a terrible, ungovernable animal passion took possession of him. With his arm round her, he made her sit down on the bed, and feeling that there was something more to be done, he sat down beside her. "Dmitri Ivanovitch, dear, please let me go," she said, with a piteous voice. "Matrona Pavlovna is coming," she cried, tearing herself away. Someone was really coming to the door. "Well then, I'll come to you in the night," he whispered. "You'll be alone?" "What are you thinking of? On no account. No, no," she said, but only with her lips. The tremulous confusion of her whole being said something very different. It was Matrona Pavlovna who had come to the door. She came in with a blanket over her arm, looking reproachfully at Nekhludoff, and began scolding Katusha for having taken the wrong blanket. Nekhludoff went out in silence, but he did not even feel ashamed. He could see by Matrona Pavlovna's face that she was blaming him. He knew that she was blaming him with reason, and he felt that he was doing wrong, but this novel, low animal excitement, having freed itself of all the old feelings of real love for Katusha, ruled supreme, leaving room for nothing else. He went about as if demented all the evening, now into his aunt's, then back into his own room, then out into the porch, thinking all the time how he would meet her alone. But she avoided him, and Matrona Pavlovna watched her closely. End of Book 1, Chapter 16.